Before the land was drained and the water sent away, before the land grab, before the imbalance, there stood a pine. It had grown slowly in the pine rockland of the Miami Rock Ridge, with dense pitch to shield it from the harsh elements. Then it was cut, milled into lumber, and became a large beam under the floor of a house, which for almost 100 years was a home, a shelter, a refuge. All around, a great city sprung up, a Caribbean metropolis with shiny towers and sparkling riches. Almost all the pines were gone. The house fell into disrepair. Soon after came the machine, which demolished the house into an unrecognizable pile of splinter, dust, and rubble. Amidst the destruction lay the pine beam, bearing some scars and the patina of age, but otherwise unscathed. The beam was pulled out, wrenched from the deceased home, and saved. The beam needs to go back home, to where it belongs. Its journey an atonement through which we will learn. Welcome to Miami Preserves, the podcast where we explore historic places in Miami and what it means to preserve our history. I'm your host, Lucia Meneses. I'm also the school programs manager at Dade Heritage Trust. In 1972, a nonprofit organization called Dade Heritage Trust was established with a mission to preserve Miami-Dade County's architectural, environmental, and cultural heritage through education, advocacy, and preservation. In the first season of Miami Preserves, we explored Miami history and preservation through the lens of African American historic sites. We featured conversations with historians and scholars about segregation in Miami. And we also heard from teachers and students in Miami-Dade County and how they are navigating some of the changes taking place in Florida's education system. In the end, we tried to make sense of preservation and its future in a city that is so development-oriented. If you haven't already listened to the first season, I encourage you to do so. All 4 episodes are available wherever you listen to podcasts. In this season, we're going to focus on trees.
Look at those trees.
I just want to see green leaves again.
And a forest and a tall trees.
They're alive, Ashley. The trees. They're alive.
Why, there's trees out there, big tall pines, just a-reaching and a-reaching, as if they wanted to climb right through the gates of heaven.
Why trees matter, who has them, who doesn't, and what's being done to protect them. In Miami, where concrete grows faster than trees and development is relentless, the story of our environment is the story of who we are and who we're becoming. Today, Miami's tree canopy coverage is hovering at around just 20%, which is far below what's needed to cool our neighborhoods, mitigate flooding, and protect us from rising temperatures. In some low-income and historically underserved neighborhoods, it's as low as 5%. But before we dive into those urgent questions like why are we losing trees, where they're disappearing, and who's most affected, we're going to step back and ask, how did we get here?
History and the past is all around us, and it's hidden, and it can be seen in the trees.
That's Malcolm Lauredo, a Miami native and local historian. I invited Malcolm on the podcast to discuss South Florida's drastic transformation, back to a time before high-rises and highways, before the swamp was drained, before Miami was a city.
It can be seen in the foliage and the shrubs. It's something that really connects you to what this place is and what this place was, and really what made this place what it is. And it's funny to have seen in such a short period of time, 128 years the city's existed, that a jungle has been so commodified so quickly.
This phenomenon that Malcolm is describing is why Miami is often referred to as the Magic City, a tropical jungle and wetland that transformed almost overnight, or 128 years to be exact. This transformation didn't happen by accident or magic. It was orchestrated by powerful individuals and systems that only saw value in the land once it was drained, cleared, and reshaped. The profits went to those who could afford to shape it, people like Henry Flagler, Carl Fisher, and David Fairchild. Indigenous communities and Black Bahamian laborers rarely reaped the benefits. And today, many of the neighborhoods with the least access to trees and green space are the same communities that were excluded from that early prosperity. In Miami, the commodification of nature transformed water into wealth, but only for the few.
This is a world of water, South Florida, and we could break it down into 3 or 4 bodies of water. The Miami River is where the fresh water of the Everglades meets the salt water of the Atlantic and creates this brackish environment where it's not one thing or the other, but both, maybe at the same time. In these brackish shorelines, we would come up on the mangrove coastlines, the grand mangrove shorelines. So you had to trek through a semi-submerged mangrove forest to get to any sort of high ground. So we move further inland, right? We've moved from the Atlantic and we've gone into Biscayne Bay and we made our way through the mangrove coastline, and the elevation is getting a little higher, and we come across a tropical hardwood hammock. It's thick, it's moist, it's overcast. You can smell it, you can feel it. You have trees like gumbo limbo and live oak and ficus and buttonwood, and it's all just very claustrophobic, and all these trees are sort of fighting for any space they can get the sun's beams. Really just ultra diverse.
It can be difficult to imagine this world that Malcolm is describing, a Miami so different from our experience today. When we take students on field trips through the tropical hardwood hammock at Simpson Park as part of our Historic Places Green Spaces education program, we have to get them to imagine that world. For many of the students we work with, this is their only exposure to a native forest. Most of these students come from neighborhoods where there are few parks, little canopy, and not a lot of room to just be in nature. Simpson Park becomes a window into a Miami they rarely get to experience, even though it once covered the entire city. And just to give you a sense of what you might hear in the urban forest today, here's some audio we recorded during one of our school field trips to Simpson Park.
I just want to take a moment and just listen really quickly to the sounds that we hear. So I'll be quiet. You can close your eyes if you want, or you can just listen really quick to the sounds. What do you hear?
Corridor, city life. City meets nature. The plan was also flying.
Overwhelming. It almost feels absurd, right? Because you are surrounded by all these trees, yet you don't hear as many of those natural sounds. But I like to stop here and talk about how Simpson Park is an urban forest. And what does that mean? What is an urban forest?
It's in an urban area.
In an urban area. What is an urban area?
Place filled with people and cities and buildings.
Filled with people. Like, we're not in the countryside. We're next to a big, busy city with traffic and construction and trains and things like that. So it's noisy here.
Simpson Park is located in Brickell, the financial district. Brickell is one of the wealthiest, most rapidly developing parts of the city. This park provides much-needed green space in an area that has very little tree canopy overall. It's a reminder that rapid development doesn't always mean better living. Even luxury neighborhoods can be environmental deserts. To understand the fight for preserving our canopy today, we have to understand what was here before. Malcolm was just taking us past the tangled mangrove shorelines, through the dense and humid tropical hardwood hammock. And now we're going somewhere totally different.
And as we go through the hammock, the tree line starts to sort of thin out a little bit. Elevation is going up a little bit. And now here we are in the pine rocklands, which was a incredibly defining feature of what it meant to be in Miami in the before times. If you saw those pine trees, you knew it was a good place to set up shop because pine trees don't like to get their feet wet. So you knew it was dry land in a world, again, that is surrounded by water.
Just to pause here for a minute to talk about the pine rockland. On the surface, it may not look like much, just a sparse, dry landscape with scattered pine trees and grasses. But it's a lot more than that. The amount of biodiversity is incredible, and so much has yet to be discovered. Here's Jennifer Possley, biologist and director for regional conservation at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens, to tell you more about it.
Well, pine rocklands are the ecosystem that was here before Miami was developed.
It was in the highest parts of our county on what we call the Miami Rock Ridge. It's just the rocky high ground. It's a forest with one single canopy tree, the South Florida slash pine, and a layer of small trees and shrubs, primarily of West Indian origin. And then the understory is where all the good stuff is. It's really diverse suite of wildflowers and grasses. And that's what's exciting to people like me who are interested in plant diversity. There's just a lot going on. So much, in fact, that even now, today, we're finding new species, describing new species. It's an exciting place to be, even if it's not what people think of as a forest, and it's not also something that lends itself well to landscaping, but it's a really special part of our heritage here in South Florida.
Unfortunately, there's not much pine rockland left. Miami has lost 98% of its native pine rockland habitat, a place more biologically diverse than most rainforests. That forest wasn't just beautiful, it was foundational, but it was cleared to build the city we now live in. Jennifer describes exactly how little of it is left.
Luckily, there's a large tract preserved within Everglades National Park, and that's the Long Pine Key area. So in the part outside of Everglades, there's about 1% left. And the sad thing is that that is the part where the biodiversity was the highest. Many of our federally endangered species are present in the Miami fragments that are left, but not in Everglades National Park. So it's wonderful that we have the Long Pine Key region, but I think there's a misconception that, oh, well, there's that big tract of pine rockland over there. But it's different. The part that we have here in Miami is unique.
Scientists like Jennifer are actively trying to restore some of these historic tracts of pine rockland today. I initially invited her to talk about it because I was curious how restoration of historic pine rockland areas might conflict with Miami-Dade County's goals to increase tree canopy. If pine rocklands need fewer trees to thrive, how do we reconcile that with calls to plant more trees? What does restoration mean in a city that desperately needs both biodiversity and canopy?
Where we want to put tree canopy and where we want to restore pine rocklands, I think, are not usually the same footprint. We need more trees in our cities where people live desperately. It's an eyesore, it's hot, it's dangerous to have neighborhoods in Miami without trees. But some of the preserves that are left that are pine rockland can also be really good for neighborhoods. They can provide some shade. Pine rockland in an urban area can improve air quality. And it's also just an undeveloped space, which I think everybody kind of appreciates in Miami, where traffic is so bad and things can be so crowded. Just to have some spaces that aren't full of condos and strip malls is a nice thing too. I see them as kind of parallel, restoring pine rocklands and restoring urban canopy don't have to be in conflict at all.
We'll discuss the county's plans in more detail in a later episode. As Malcolm was saying, South Florida was a world of water.
The sheer small amount of dry land. We're talking about, like 2 miles, like a sliver. So Miami, if you think about it, is a peninsula on a peninsula, because it's a peninsula in that we're surrounded by water of Biscayne Bay and the ocean to the east and the water of the Everglades to the west. The Miami River, I think, is a real neat focal point for a lot of reasons. It's ground zero for human habitation. It always has been. It's the light to which we have been drawn to in this part of the world.
The first inhabitants of South Florida, the Tequesta tribe, established settlements along some of these different bodies of water, like the Miami River. This tribe eventually died out as a result of settlement battles with Europeans, slavery, and disease. But the river continued to be a place of refuge for displaced Native Americans, and even early white settlers. But it wasn't easy getting down here at the time, for anyone.
The late, great Arvamore Parks referred to South Florida as the forgotten frontier, because everyone thinks of the final frontier, go west, Pilgrim, out in the west in California.
We're bringing you fascinating tales of the Old West, where cowboys still follow the cattle trail.
The rippenest, roaringest, fightingest man the frontier ever knew.
Carrying eager young immigrants to a new life in the American West. Theirs was a journey that, by today's standards, can hardly be imagined.
But South Florida was really a wilderness much after the activity that was going on in California. So you have this similar sort of like rough and tough kind of pioneer Oregon Trail vibes. But instead of wagons and ox, you had sailboats because there were no roads. So boats were how people got around, that they were highways, essentially. If you didn't have a boat, you couldn't participate in whatever economies were happening down here.
One of the first major industries happening down here at the time was the harvesting and processing of a native cycad, commonly known as kunti. Here's Malcolm describing how the Seminoles processed and used this plant.
Kunti is known as arrowroot, very ancient type of plant. And if you take the roots and you squish it in the right ways and do the right things to it, you get a sort of like floury paste, and you can use it to thicken stews, kind of make some bread. If you do it wrong, you die.
The Seminoles had been processing kunti for generations. White settlers learned from them, then turned that knowledge into profit. Kunti became a short-lived but major industry for settlers in the late 1800s, but it wasn't sustainable. The plant grows slowly, and within a few decades, it had been nearly wiped out. The story of kunti might seem like a historic fun fact, but it echoes the bigger story of Miami's environment. What we take, who profits, and what we leave behind. The kunti industry eventually collapsed, but the idea of reshaping the environment lived on. Only now, it was different. Instead of harvesting native plants, people came to experiment and introduce new ones.
What people were really nerding out about were all these plants, because all of a sudden, you have people who grew up in Ohio and never seen a palm tree in their life. There was this period in the late 1800s where there was great experimentation in what grows in the tropics or the subtropics outside of the US that can be cultivated here in South Florida. So the fact that you could grow so many different types of things here that you couldn't grow anywhere else in the US, all these tropic trees, it's what drew a lot of the hardcore people here before the city was founded in 1896.
Like Malcolm says, South Florida was a place of experimentation. Maybe it still is. David Fairchild is one who introduced hundreds of plants to South Florida, with dreams of creating a botanical garden in Miami. A tropical plant station was established at one point on Indian Key, where folks like Henry Perrine would experiment and plant all kinds of exotic species. Many of the tropical fruit trees we've come to love and associate with South Florida were introduced during this era of experimentation. Malcolm also makes an interesting point about how the concept of environmentalism has evolved over time.
A lot of these who maybe we might call environmentalists, right, of the 1800s and the early 20th century really did not abide by the same sort of what environmentalism means today. The environment would empower people, not by preserving it, but by land being given to people so that they could clear it and make prosperity for themselves. So progress and nature and appreciation of the values of being tied to nature have changed. And during Fairchild's and the Deerians, it was kind of just like a let's mess around and find out.
These early experiments may have seemed harmless at the time, but some of the species they brought in, without considering long-term consequences, are now threatening what little native forest we have left. When I asked Jennifer about some of the challenges with preserving pine rockland habitats today, she said invasives are a major challenge for this habitat that relies on wildfires.
Invasive species can be really persistent. They have designed these strategies to be invasive and to stick around for years or decades. So in pine rocklands, there's a species called Burma reed, which is a really tall grass. It can be 3 or 4 meters tall with a big plume on the top. But those big grasses are a pain. They're hard to get rid of. They form seeds really quickly. And then they also affect the fire regime. So in a healthy pine rockland, the fire would kind of be creeping along the understory and then burning a palm here and there. But those big grasses, they go up like a torch, and they can create a lot of smoke and hazardous materials. Aside from just taking up space where native species would be, they're kind of hazardous too for people and wildlife.
So an invasive species is a non-native, meaning that they are introduced in an area where they do not originate. And they can also be harmful to the environment and to human health, as Jennifer was saying. They grow aggressively and try to outcompete native species. So mango and avocado trees are non-native, but they're not invasive like the Burma reed grass Jennifer mentioned. And that's an important distinction between non-native and invasive. So every invasive is a non-native, but not every non-native is invasive. This becomes really important later when we discuss tree protections in Miami and which trees are considered worthy of protections and which ones are not. But even the topic and management of invasive species varies depending on who you talk to. Here's Malcolm's take on it.
Not being from Miami is one of the most Miamian things you can be. More than half the people I think who live in Dade County were born in a different country. So I think like by nature, a Miamian is, so an invasive. I guess we're all invasive, What is a Miamian, right? If you write it, I say this all the time, but if you write it on Microsoft Word, you get a red squiggly line because the technocracy doesn't want us to believe that it's an identity. But, something that ties us together as Miamians are shared experiences like the environment, the trees, the sky, the hammock, the bay. These are all kind of things that we can experience together, even though we see that there are large discrepancies in who's able to enjoy what remains of Miami's beautiful and complicated wilderness. It's almost become an interesting aspect of being here is that you have this exotic intermingling of what belongs and what doesn't belong and a sort of fight for it.
This fight for belonging among native and non-native species is not unlike the fight between humans and nature, humans and their relentless goal to control it, to rise above it. And we kinda did. Between 1915 and 1926, the historic flow of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades to Biscayne Bay was forever altered to minimize flooding and control the river of grass, the infamous draining of the swamp. The shallow bay was dredged to accommodate larger boats and filled to expand the coast for increased development. Mangrove trees, which lined the entire coast, were removed, and slash pine trees were harvested for lumber. Just when we thought we could tame the land, suddenly something happened. One summer night in 1926, a natural disaster, one that we Floridians know only too well.
This morning, a monster storm unleashing its fury overnight on Florida's Gulf Coast.
Right now, we do have a hurricane warning in effect for all of southwest Florida.
Winds were a steady 140 miles an hour, and by the time it was across the state and into the Gulf of Mexico, 8 people had died in the storm. We begin in Miami.
When the 26th hurricane hit on September 17th, late at night, that hurricane smacked Miami right where it hurts. When they had no idea what was happening, there had been a huge influx of newcomers. More than 80% had never experienced a hurricane. First part of the storm happened at night, and then everyone's like, oh, that was pretty bad, and they come out and they're looking around, not understanding that they're in the middle.
They're in the eye.
And that's when folks got swept out. A wave just washed clean across Miami Beach. It was horrifying and it was a reckoning, and it was one of many moments where Miami has been forced to confront the fact that nature is not as malleable as we think, and that we don't really have a say in when nature is gonna pipe up and make us rethink where we live, how we live. And I think what's important about that hurricane too is that we forgot about that hurricane. I think what's important about that boom is that we forgot about that boom. We're in this state of constant rediscovery. I think we're becoming old enough as a city now, just like as people get old enough and they can look to their past and notice trends and understand themselves. I think that we're starting to see the trends a little more clearly. I hope we do more good before we do more bad.
What's happening today with unequal canopy loss, development pressures, and insufficient protections is not new. It's a continuation of the past. And while we may think we've learned from the past, the numbers tell a different story. The county set a goal to reach 30% tree canopy coverage by 2020, but that didn't happen. Overall, it has remained largely unchanged for years at only about 20%. Low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods with predominantly Black and Latino residents have as little as 5% in some cases. The American Forest Science Advisory Board recommends 40 to 60% tree canopy cover to mitigate rising temperatures and flooding. So it's easy to get discouraged by statistics and digital renderings of our future. But when I think about the students we bring to Simpson Park, standing wide-eyed under the canopy of a forest they've never seen, it's a reminder of what Miami used to be and what it could be for everyone. But Malcolm has an interesting and sometimes humorous way of thinking about the future.
We're either going to be this sort of Venice of the Americas with jet skis, or, Turkey Point is going to blow up because of rising sea levels, and then the crocodiles are going to sprout two heads and walk around, and they're going to start crossbreeding with the alligators, and, then you're going to have crocs on the mainland, and it's going to be abandoned by the US, and then communist Cuba is going to come over and take over the watery ruins. But it's an exciting story, and because I live here, I try not to let myself be beat up by the city. I don't want to be victimized by my city. I want to feel like I have a say in changing the city. It's a fine line, like becoming too nostalgic where you're living in the past, but you also want to leave room for the present. I want to make a mess too. Everyone else got here before me, and they all made a big mess, and looks like they had terrible fun doing it.
In order to predict what might happen next, we're going to explore what's happening right now with respect to trees in our environment. In the next episode, we'll discuss the benefits of having more tree canopy, even as our population continues to grow, as well as the unequal distribution of trees in Miami. And what do residents think about trees? Do they want to see more trees in their neighborhoods?
Well, it's, of course, extremely important to protect trees and the canopy, but it sometimes doesn't look good when the only thing that you care about in the neighborhood is trees and not people.
Thank you for listening to Miami Preserves. Miami Preserves is written and produced by me, Lucia Meneses, and co-produced and edited by Forrest Canaday. The views expressed by the speakers on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Dade Heritage Trust, its board of directors, or its members. Special thanks to the Wolfson Family Foundation for sponsoring this project. And thank you to all the guests featured in today's episode.
Malcolm Lauredo,
who currently maintains a Knight Foundation-funded Miami history practice called the Greater Miami Bureau of Time Tourism. To learn more about what he is doing, you can follow him on Instagram at Bureau of Time Tourism.
Jennifer Possley,
who continues to discover new pine rockland species every day. To learn more about the conservation work she's doing with pine rockland and the history of Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, visit their website, fairchildgarden.org.
Nick Gilmore,
a Miami-based artist who works primarily with salvaged South Florida pine wood. Nick provided the poem you heard at the top of the episode, which was part of a performance titled Going Home, Act 1. For a complete version of the poem and to learn more about his work, visit his website, gilmoreworks.com. Our theme music is called Presence by Taylor Vega and performed by the YMU Jazz Collective. To learn more about Dade Heritage Trust and for a complete transcript of episodes, visit our website, dadeheritagetrust.org. And thank you to DHT's fearless leader, Executive Director Christine Rupp. Chris grew up in Ohio and still remembers what it was like coming to South Florida for the first time.
What people were really nerding out about were all these plants, because all of a sudden you have people who grew up in Ohio and never seen a palm tree in their life.
Thanks again for listening, and be sure to follow and subscribe to the Miami Preserves podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Tune in next time for episode 2.